All right, the penetration of North America. While the Spanish were destroying the Caribbean and Mesoamerican region, the Portuguese were carrying out similar campaigns in Brazil. The patterns established by the Spanish would be repeated by Portuguese during the 16th and 17th centuries in Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. By the beginning of the 17th century, the Spanish and Portuguese had penetrated virtually every region in the southern hemisphere, establishing numerous settlements facilitated with the help of Jesuit and Franciscan missionaries, as well as mines, ranches, and plantations. Despite all this, there were still large areas in which European claims to lands remained a theoretical proposition. These areas remained outside of European control, with fierce indigenous resistance. This was particularly so in the southern regions. During this period, French, Dutch, and advanced elements of British also established settlements in the Caribbean. In 1604, the French occupied the island of Guadeloupe, followed by the island of Martinique and various smaller islands in the West Indies. In 1635, they occupied what is now French Guiana. Meanwhile, the Dutch occupied a coastal region that would eventually become Suriname. Hold on, there's somebody walking around. Meanwhile, the Dutch occupied a coastal region that would eventually become Suriname, Dutch Guiana, as well as settlements established by the Dutch West India Company in the area of Belize, which would later become a British colony. The Dutch, French, and British were relatively limited in their exploits in the South Americas, and it would be in North America where their main efforts would be directed. As has already been noted, French expeditions had penetrated the northeastern regions of what would become Quebec and the Atlantic provinces. In the 1530s, so French were already in North America. In 1562 and 1564, the French attempted to establish settlements in South Carolina and Florida, but were driven out by Spanish, who had claimed Florida in 1539 during De Soto's perilous expedition. Also, Spanish were already in Florida claiming it, and some of the French tried to go there too. So French came from the top and from all the way to the south by Florida. So French were hustling, but Spain was actually hustling too. They were already there. But you know what I mean? So because where Canada is, French got that, and then they were already trying to go all over there to Florida, you know. In 1585, the British also attempted settlements on Roanoke Island in North Carolina, and again in 1586. Both attempts failed when the settlers-to-be were unable to survive. In the period up to 1600, more reconnaissance, in the period up to 1600, more reconnaissance missions were conducted. In 1576, Martin Frobisher charted the Arctic coast encountering Inuk, and in 1578 Francis Drake charted the coast of California. Meanwhile, the Spanish were pushing into North America from their bases in southern Mexico, encountering resistance from the Pueblos and others. In the beginning of 1600s, as the horse spread throughout the southwest and into the plains, Samuel de Champlain expanded on Cartier's earlier expedition, penetrating as far west as Lake Huron and Lake Ontario. His attacks on Onondaga communities using Wendat, Huron warriors would turn to Haudenosaunee against the French. In 1606, the British finally succeeded in establishing their first permanent settlement in North America at Jamestown. In 1606, the British finally succeeded in establishing their first permanent settlement in North America at Jamestown, Virginia. In 1620, Pilgrims, English Puritans, landed on the East Coast, also establishing the Plymouth colony. Meanwhile, Beothuks and Newfoundland had retaliated against the French attack, and clashes that followed killed 37 French settlers. The French responded by arming Micmacs, traditional enemies of the Beothuks, and offering bounties for Beothuk scalps. This is believed to the origin of scalp taking by native warriors. The stereotype of native savagery was in fact introduced by the French and later the Dutch. The combined attacks by the French and Micmacs led to the eventual extermination of the Beothuk nation. In 1624, the Dutch established Fort Orange, later to become Albany, New York, and claimed the area as New Netherland, while the Atlantic coast area of North America was becoming quickly littered with British, French, and Dutch settlements. Substantial differences in the lands and resources forced the focus of exploitation to differ from the colonization process underway in Meso and South America. In the South, the large-scale expropriation of gold and silver financed much of the invasion. As well, the dense populations of the indigenous peoples provided a large slave labor force to work in the first mines and plantations. In contrast, the Europeans who began colonizing North America found a lower population density, and the lands, though fertile for crops and abundant in fur-bearing animals, contained little in precious metals accessible to 17th century European technology. The exploitation of North America was to require long-term activities which could not rely on indigenous or African slavery, but in fact which required indigenous participation. Maintaining colonies thousands of miles away from Europe and lacking the gold which financed the Spanish Armada, the colonial forces in North America would have to rely on the gradual accumulation of agricultural products and the fur trade. In this way, the initial settlements relied largely on the hospitality afforded them by the native peoples. Earlier attempts at European settlements had failed for precisely this reason, as the Europeans found themselves almost completely ignorant of the land. The growing European colonies quickly set about acquiring already cleared and cultivated land, and their expansionist policies led to fierce competition between the colonies. This bitter struggle for domination of land and trade frequently began and ended with attacks against indigenous communities. One of the first of these strategic attacks occurred in 1622 when a force from the Plymouth colony massacred a group of Pequots, Pequots. In retaliation, Pequot warriors attacked a settler village at Wessagoset, which was then abandoned and subsequently absorbed into the dominion of the Plymouth colony, which had coveted the trade and land enjoyed by the Wessagoset settlers. By 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had been established, and New England, once only a vague geographical expression, came to apply in practice to the colonies of New Plymouth, Salem, Nantucket, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Haven, and others. By 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had been established. This is all near the water, because you had to take water, so they pretty much, like Virginia has water, they're on the shore. So that's why these places are important. By 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had been established, and New England, once only a vague geographical expression, came to apply in practice to the colonies of New Plymouth, Salem, Nantucket, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Haven, and others. The expansionist drives of the Massachusetts colonists consisted of massacres carried out against first the Pequot and eventually the Narragansetts between 1634 and 1648. It was in this period that the transition between European dependence on native peoples began to be reversed. Through the establishment and expansion of European colonies, increased contact with First Nations brought extensive trading, as well as disease, epidemics, and conflict. Trade gradually served to break up indigenous societies. In quotes, Indian industry became less specialized and divided as it entered into closer relations of exchange with European industry. For the Indians, intersocietal commerce triumphed by subordinating and eliminating all crafts except those directly related to European Indian trade, while intertribal trading relations survived only insofar as they served the purposes of intersocietal trade. Thus, trade with the European industry developed a relationship of growing dependence on the European colonists. The items traded to natives, metal pots, knives, and occasionally rifles, were of European manufacture and supply. The trade also disrupted and changed traditional native methods in other ways, with the introduction of alcohol and exterminationist forms of warfare, including torture under the direction of colonialists, as well as an overall escalation in warfare and the competition-driven fur trade and introduction of European rifles. While disease epidemics began to spread throughout the Atlantic coastal area, the colonialists also relied to a large extent on exploiting and exaggerating already existing hostilities between First Nations, as the Spanish and the Portuguese had also done in their campaigns. The grim epics of Cortez and Pizarro, not to speak of Columbus himself, testify to the military abilities of Spanish soldiery, but these need to be compared as well with the great failures of Narvaez, Coronado and De Soto, the conquistadors, did not conquer Mexico and Peru unaided. Native allies were indispensable. North of New Spain, invasion started later, so Frenchmen, Dutchmen, and Englishmen found native communities already reduced by epidemic from base populations that never approached the size of Mexico. It was at this time that the concept of treaty making began to take hold. In keeping with the English colonists' early plans of keeping some level of peace with the natives, as in 1606 when, in quotes, the Virginia Company of London instructed its colonists to buy a stock of corn from the naturals before the English intention. So the Virginia Company of London, so I feel like it's a London company that's in Virginia now, instructed its colonists to buy a stock of corn from the naturals before the English intention to settle permanently should become evident. Also, so to buy something from them before the English intention to settle permanently should become evident. The company's chiefs were sure that you cannot carry yourselves so towards them, but they will grow discontented with your habitation. The initial English and Dutch settlers began the process of purchasing land, supplemented as always with armed force against vulnerable indigenous nations, such as those decimated by disease or already engaged in wars with more powerful First Nations. It remains unclear as to what the First Nations understood of the local purchasing process, but some points are clear. There was no practice of private ownership of land nor of selling land among or between the peoples prior to the arrival of the colonialists. There were, however, agreements and pacts between First Nations in regards to access to hunting and fishing areas. This would indicate treaties were most likely understood as agreements between First Nations and settler communities over use of certain areas of land, as well as non-aggressiveness pacts. In either case, where First Nations remained powerful enough to deter initial settler outrages, the treaties were of little effect if they turned out to be less than honorable, and there was enough duplicity, fraud, and theft contained in the treaties that they could not be considered binding. Practices such as orally translating one version of a treaty and signing another on paper were frequent, as was taking European proposals in negotiations and claiming that these had been agreed upon by all, when in fact they were being negotiated. As well, violations of treaty agreements by settlers was commonplace, particularly as, for example, the Virginia colony discovered the profitability of growing tobacco introduced to the settlers by native peoples and began expanding on their initial land base. Gradually, First Nations along the Atlantic found themselves dispossessed of their lands and victims of settler depredation. So gradually, First Nations along the Atlantic found themselves dispossessed of their lands and victims of settler depredations. One of the first conflicts that seriously threatened to drive the colonialist forces back into the sea broke out in 1622 when the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Opech and Canoe, attacked the Jamestown colony. Clashes continued until 1644, when Opech Canoe was captured and killed. So for 20 years? Gradually, First Nations along the Atlantic found themselves dispossessed of their lands and victims of settler care. By the mid-1600s, clashes between natives and settlers began to increase. Tensions grew as the Europeans became more obtuse and domineering in their relationship with the First Nations. In 1655, for example, the so-called Peach Wars erupted between colonialists of New Netherlands and the Delaware Nation, when a Dutchman killed a Delaware woman for picking a peach tree on the colony's property. The settler was subsequently killed, and Delaware warriors attacked several Dutch settlements. Delaware women for picking. The settler was subsequently killed, and Delaware warriors attacked several Dutch settlements. The fighting along the Hudson River lasted until 1664, when the Dutch forced the Delaware Nation into submission by kidnapping Delaware children as hostages. In 1675, the Narragansetts, Nipmucks, and Wampanoags, led in part by Metacom, also known as King Philip by the Europeans, rebelled against the colonies in New England following the English arrest and execution of 3 Wampanoags for the alleged killing of a Christianized native believed to be a traitor. The war ended in 1676 after the English colonialists, making use of native allies and informers, were able to defeat the rebellion. Metacom was killed and his family and hundreds of others sold to slavers in the West Indies. The military campaign carried out by the colonial forces decimated the Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations, Meanwhile, in 1680, a Pueblo Uprising, led in part by the Tewa medicine man Pope, succeeded in driving out the Spanish from New Mexico. By 1689, Spanish forces were able to once again subjugate the Pueblos. By the late 1600s, the competition between European states would dominate the colonization process in North America. Okay, by the late 1600s, the competition between European states would dominate the colonization process in North America. Also, saying all these other, European states are competing to get all this land, So that's filling up North America. All right, yo, peace.